Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 13 on the Name of the Rose, and tonight we discuss the naughty bits. So, little warning here. We're going to be discussing particularly salacious passages from the Bible tonight, just so that everybody knows. Mature audiences only, please, this evening. But I am delighted to say I just got home from Osmoot, was down in Australia visiting our wonderful friends down there, where it was delightful. Had a wonderful time down in Melbourne. Such a great group, the Osmoot group is. I strongly recommend joining them if you get a chance to join them for Osmoot. And on a related note, I wanted to tell everybody there will be more information coming soon. But we had some discussion at the end of Osmoot about future plans, and I wanted to let you know that we've planned out the next two Osmoots. Next year is going to be back in Australia again, and this time we're going to be meeting in Canberra, the capital of Australia. So we've been in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra next year, which will be fun. The year after that, however, so in January, maybe early February, dates TBA, of 2027, which feels like really far off, but it's actually not, 2 years from now, we are officially going to be holding our moot in Wellington, New Zealand. The Kiwi moot that we have been wanting and hoping for a long time is actually going to happen. And we are already discussing venues and other things to do, and talking with our new friends down at Weta Workshop and a bunch of things. So we're hoping to kind of make a fun thing of it down there. So I'm letting folks know, because so basically it's sort of the schedule will be, we're not going to open registration for it soon, but of course, if we're going to do, as we'd like to do, a New Zealand moot in which we, do a bunch of add-on stuff. So we'll do a regular moot, like we'll do an Osmoot. We'll do it like Osmoot. We can't call it Osmoot because the New Zealanders won't have it, but because that's an Australia thing. But anyway, yeah. So we are going to need, if people want to do additional stuff. So we'll do the moot, and then we'll do additional activities either before the moot or after the moot or both. Anyway, so we're going to plan to do it that way. And people who want to be involved in the other stuff, we're going to have to make reservations and pay stuff in advance and all that kind of thing. So we're going to need to do for this moot what we've never had to do for regional moots before, and that is take deposits and things in advance. We're kind of working all that stuff out. Yeah, JJ, it was pointed out when we were there that like actually NZ moot is just like the tiniest move of one character away from Osmoot, isn't it? But Kiwi moot, I think, is probably more likely to be the NZ moot is a little hard to say, fairly clunky. Anyhow, I did want to let people know. I know that it's kind of a big thing, and of course, you won't even be able to buy plane tickets until like 11 months in advance. Generally, that's when plane tickets go on sale. So we won't be doing final, reservations and stuff until like a year from now at earliest. But during this coming year, we want to warn people that it's coming, so you can start making plans if that's something that is of interest to you to come down. Basically, the goal is anyone who's ever been to a regional moot, one of Signum's regional moots, knows how much fun it is to spend the day in the company of delightful, like-minded people. And many people I know have always cherished the idea of making a New Zealand trip and doing a bunch of the Tolkien touring available down there. And the opportunity to combine those two things, to be able to go down and do those things with a Signum group, in the company of a Signum, in the excellent company of a Signum group, will be a pretty fun opportunity. I know. I really look forward to that. I've never been to New Zealand myself. There will be volcanoes. Chucking jewelry into them will be optional. I think you would have to probably provide your own jewelry there. Anyhow, so as I say, I wanted to just kind of let people know. We'll talk about it a little bit more as the year continues, but wanted to let everybody know that's kind of what's in the works. For, again, not next year, but a year from then. Of course, in the much shorter term, we have Sunshine Moot coming up. That is our next regional moot down in Orlando, Florida. That's going to be and it's almost February, not quite February, about a month from now, end of February. What is it? I should know the date. 24th, something like that. Right around there. So somebody can tell me what the Saturday is there. I'm losing track of my dates. Hey, I've been time traveling lately. I can't even keep track of what day of the week it is this week. I have had extras this week as I've been traveling back from Australia. Feels like it's already the weekend, but it's not the weekend. But anyway, the Sunshine Moot in Orlando is going to be particularly fun. The theme of Sunshine Moot this year is the Muppet Lord of the Rings. So we're going to spend the entire day doing a film-esque planning of how we would do a Muppet adaptation of the Lord of the Rings. This would be, I think, a moot that would be particularly interesting to attend remotely if you can't come in person to join us in Orlando. So anyway, yes, the 22nd, I was close. February 22nd, that is in fact the date of Sunshine Moot. All right, well, let us jump in. I've put off this scandalous passage for long enough. It is time. Almost time to turn to that scandalous work, the Song of Solomon. The end of day 2. But let me say a word for a minute about. I've recommended that you read the Song of Solomon if you haven't before in preparation for this session. I hope appropriate people got parental permission before doing that. It is always, I find it to be always a surprise to modern readers, the status that the Song of Solomon had in the medieval church. I've read, so I used to teach a Bible survey class in my English department back at the secular liberal arts college that I used to teach in, because my premise was I'm sick of English majors not getting the Bible references in all the books that we read. So you're gonna familiar. So and I didn't have them write papers. They just took quizzes. Like I just quizzed them mercilessly. The quizzes and tests were all, not the quizzes. The quizzes were simple factual quizzes about the reading. Do you remember the stuff? And then the tests were all, I just give them passages of literature that make allusions, and they had to explain them. Anyway, okay. So whenever I've had modern people, like modern students, reading the Song of Solomon for the first time, they would all be rather shocked, and they all assumed that like the medieval church tried to hide this bit. Right. That this was like the scandalous part of the Bible, that like maybe this is part of the reason why, like they didn't want it translated into the vernacular so that, like the people would know it's in there because it would be such a scandal or something like that. No, not true at all. In fact, the Song of Solomon was one of the most popular books of the Bible, Old Testament and New. It's in the Hebrew Bible. It's in the Old Testament. It's part of the Wisdom of Solomon books. What's in there with like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Psalms and stuff. But anyway, yeah, they loved this. They loved it. This was hugely popular. In fact, this was the book when St. Augustine, in a book I've mentioned before, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian teaching, which is basically like a how to interpret the Bible handbook for priests. If you are a young priest or scholar and you need some guidance on how to interpret the Bible, St. Augustine wrote this handy handbook for you, which is really cool and enormously influential throughout the Middle Ages. And of course, when he tries to illustrate the principles that he's doing, his very first example is the exact passage that Adso quotes several times and that the people in Discord have been joking about for a long time now. And that is the "her teeth are like sheep" description. It's the passage that he goes to demonstrate, like, he's like, it's the first thing that occurs to him. It's like, obviously this is where we're going to go to talk about how to understand the Bible. Anyway, so the understanding, I want to provide this important context first. Okay, so the medieval understanding of this, you will not be surprised to hear, is an allegorical interpretation, right? That is to say, the erotic love poetry is an allegorical description of the relationship between Christ and the church. The church is described as the bride of Christ. Of course, we get the marriage feast of the Lamb, right? And the church in Revelation, right? At the end. So this passage is so the male figure is God or Jesus, and the female figure is a representation of the church. The church as purified. Again, there's discussion. Paul talks about this. Revelation talks about this. And of course, people who know different parts of the Bible well will know that this sort of thing, that is the use of the erotic, especially the marital relationship between man and woman, as a metaphor for God's relationship with people, it's quite a common thing. It happens all over the place. Many of you may remember, of course, Paul talking about husbands and wives and how husbands should love one another and how they're one flesh. Husbands and wives should love one another and how they're one flesh, and all of this stuff. And then at the end of that passage, he just says, "I speak, of course, concerning Christ and the church." It's just like, yeah. Anyway, so this concept is fairly deeply rooted. So on the one hand, when the medievals allegorized this, they're not just making it up out of nowhere. This idea, the marital relationship as a metaphor or allegory of the relationship between God and people, is a standing thing in the Bible. So they're not totally coming out of left field with that. Secondly, however, they were also assisted by the manner of the description. And this comes back to why several of you were laughing about this. Again, we'll see the passage, some examples of the passages several times. But many of the students who are here live have been chuckling about the how poorly the description of like, her teeth are like sheep that have just come up from the, from the washing, all bearing twins, right? Doesn't really seem like something that is likely to please a woman, right? If you try to praise her beauty that way. And that the visual that you get, if you try to picture the woman whose, breasts are like deer and, whose neck is like a tower and all this sort of thing, is a little grotesque. In fact, I've seen, and you can probably find them online, search carefully, for like images, like people have like drawn a literal like picture of what a woman who's looks like this would look like. Yeah, the goat hair, all that stuff. But anyway, the point is, it's not a visual description, right? It doesn't work that way at all. We've been trained, and I was mentioning before class that I primarily blame the Romantic poets. I blame the Romantic poets because the Romantic poets were all about the visual imagery. This is why the Romantic poets didn't understand John Donne either. The poetry of the late 16th, early 17th century, well, some of the poetry, one school of poetry, English poetry in the late 16th, early 17th century, what are often called the metaphysical poets, John Donne and Marvell and folks like that. There it is. Bricktails found one of them. That's exactly it. Anyway, the metaphysical poets, their imagery was not about stuff that you picture, like visualize. It was about stuff that you think about, right? So this is why, like, the Romantics often just didn't get it. Like they would talk about some of these poets and they're like, that's a terrible image. Well, yeah, it's a terrible image if you're visualizing, but there are other ways to proceed other than visualizing. And sometimes the Romantic poets didn't even seem to acknowledge that. And we've been kind of trained by them still. The Romantic poets had an enormous influence on, on verbal art, basically, and metaphor and the way that we think about things. And we have been carefully instructed. So much of like modern film and novels and everything are chiefly formed by this, like the prioritization of sensual imagery, I'll say, more than just visual, but just the imagery that's about perceiving things rather than more abstract imagery designed to prompt you to think in particular ways, to associate ideas together rather than just to picture them. Right. So that's that. And that is very much how it works. But the very disjunction of it, the very fact that they would look at this description of the woman, of the beautiful woman in Song of Solomon and say, that doesn't make sense as a description. It sounds like a physical description, right? But it's clearly not a physical description. They perceived clearly, as I think is clearly true, that it's pointing to abstract qualities. Right? There is something in fact intrinsically allegorical about the description. When you say her teeth are like sheep, right? You don't mean literally, right? Presumably they don't look much like sheep, even in color, because like sheep are not that white. Like anyone who's actually met sheep knows that they're not actually very white, right? So even in color, it's not a very charming comparison. And that's even if you don't spray paint them, the sheep, not the teeth. But anyway, they're like sheep. How are they like sheep? Well, it's all about like there are these images of freshness, of fecundity, of richness, even, right? And yes, Eric, it doesn't even suggest a visual distinction. It says her teeth are like sheep. How are they like sheep, right? That's what you've got to think about. What likeness is indeed being suggested when it compares the teeth to sheep? This kind of abstract comparison, to take one thing and compare it with an abstract idea, right? That's the heart of allegory. That's how allegory works, right? So St. Augustine reads a passage like this and he's like, oh, okay, yeah. right? That's why he chose it as an illustration, because he went to one of the places in the Bible where he's like, this is one of the places where the Bible like forces us to read it allegorically. Like you can't not read it allegorically. And he's almost correct about that. Even if you try to be as literal as possible and you're like, it's just erotic poetry, right? It's just like, this dude and this chick, right? Who are really into each other and think they're each other's really sexy. Even if you just think about it on that level, you still have to do a sort of allegorical interpretation, even to understand the compliments, right? And understand what exactly they're trying to do. Anyway, so that's as I say, the allegorical impulse is kind of built into that text. So there are lots of ways. So like the first impulse of my modern students was to like assume that the medievals like forbid anyone from reading it, right? And then I told them, no, the opposite is true. It's like the first text everybody reads, right? And then the second impulse was to sort of snigger at the allegorical, like, oh, I see, they're trying to like diffuse the eroticism, or like, so you protect against the eroticism, you marginalize the eroticism, right, by just turning it all into this allegory, right, into this sort of technical and boring kind of allegory, a theological allegory, thus taking all the fun out of the erotic poetry, right? And that's not quite true either, because again, like, allegory is in fact the mode. Like if you want to understand even the erotic element of it, you gotta understand, right, the allegory. Anyway, that's so neither one of those things is really true. I do think, for lots of reasons, that the text really opens the original text really presents itself to. I don't think they were very far astray in how they were reading it. In fact, I think that their reading of the Song of Solomon was closer to the way that the text seems to present itself to be read than many of the ways when they applied the same kind of allegorical method that St. Augustine is teaching to other parts of the Bible. Anyway, yeah, okay. Let us, armed with this preparation about the Song of Solomon, let us proceed into our text. We start back still with Adso and Ubertino. And I'm not going to linger on all of the creepy touching and embracing and perspiring that Ubertino does, because I'm good. If you're good, I'm good, right? I just want to refer back to it because it's there. This is when he's at the end of telling the story of Fra Dolcino, and he's talking about them being burned at the stake. And you will remember also, because it's in real time, I know it's been a while, because I've been traveling and everything. But I want to recall Ubertino's, remember the conversation that he listened to, that Adso listened to between Ubertino and Brother William, was the first thing that prompted Adso to be asking this question: how can I tell the difference between the heretic and the Orthodox believer? And specifically, the issue with Ubertino's talk was, how can you tell the holy passion, like the spiritual rapture of the great saints, from the sexual corruption of the heretics? That was an issue, right? And so this is one of the reasons why he is coming back to Ubertino, asking him the story of Fra Dolcino so he can figure this out, right? Okay. In any case, this is Ubertino. I cannot tell you everything that happened. There were terrible massacres, but in the end, the rebels were forced to surrender. Dolcino and his people were captured, and they rightly ended up on the pyre. The beautiful Margaret, too? Asks Adso with some interest. Ubertino looked at me. So, you remembered she was beautiful. She was beautiful, they say, and many local lords tried to make her their bride to save her from the stake, but she would not have it. She died impenitent with her impenitent lover, and let this be a lesson to you. Beware of the whore of Babylon, even when she assumes the form of the most exquisite creature. Okay. Yes, Kate, I agree with you. Kate says Ubertino is the worst at explaining. Somehow they erred. Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. Somehow they erred. He is not, in fact, a good explainer. Adso has not, in fact, chosen a good person to try to settle this problem that he's having for him, is he? But in any case, first important thing. Okay. We have the first paradigm of how, as a monk, young Adso is being instructed to understand the feminine, right? The female. Beware the whore of Babylon. Now, do we know who the whore of Babylon is? If you don't know who the whore of Babylon is, then you haven't read the book of Revelation as I've recommended to you. Yeah, the whore of Babylon is a figure in Revelation. By the way, Revelation, one of the reasons Revelation was enormously popular, right? The Apocalypse, enormously popular in the Middle Ages, is because it too is overtly allegorical in places, like where it is actively requesting to be read in allegorical ways. And the whore of Babylon is one clear instance of this. She is the figure of a woman. She allegorically represents the wickedness of Babylon, which itself represents the wickedness of more than just Babylon. Babylon sort of stands for the wicked worldly empires, the wicked empires of the world. It seems fairly clear that the original author of the Apocalypse, the original author of Revelation, has both Rome and Jerusalem in his sights. When he is talking about when he talks about Babylon, there, primarily Rome, but Jerusalem too. And in that, of course, he's following in line with the entire Hebrew Bible, which is one long, enormous complaint about how the priests and kings of Israel are missing the boat. But anyway, that's a story for a different day. Okay. So the whore of Babylon, the whore is, again, she's an allegorical figure. And she's called a whore because she, that is to say, she as representative of the powerful empires of the world, is selling herself to all of the rich people, right? So you've got the power figures who sell themselves out to all of the merchants and all of the everything else. Yeah. So, and she's drinking. She has a chalice, and she's drinking the blood of the saints, is what she's drinking. Yeah. Hey, Arthur, I'd love to have that talk. I would love to have that talk. Yeah, it's the entire prophets and almost the entire histories, right, are full of scandalous stories about the leadership of Israel missing the point and being complained about. I stand by that statement. I'm not saying there are no positive examples, because there are. But anyway, so whore of Babylon. But note what Ubertino is saying, why he is invoking the whore of Babylon here. He's talking about Margaret, the beautiful Margaret, the, according to him, concubine, right, consort of Fra Dolcino. She died impenitent with her impenitent lover. And let this be a lesson to you. Beware of the whore of Babylon. What's he saying? Even when she assumes the form of the most exquisite creature. He is not talking about the whore of Babylon in the allegorical context given in Revelation, where she is plainly Again, you can tell because she's got the word Babylon written on her, like literally inscribed on her person, or she's carrying a label, right? Just like that's how it's kind of a giveaway. Like if that should wave your like allegory flags if nothing else does. When you've got somebody walking around with a label on their forehead, probably they're an allegorical figure. But anyway. Ubertino is not talking about that allegory of like mighty empires and kingdoms, right? I mean, it's kind of an available thing. I mean, the emperor, right, and the struggle between the church and the emperor that the pope and the emperor that has been kind of an issue in the background all along. But he's not going there, right? It's not the Holy Roman Emperor who's the whore of Babylon, though. That's a comparison that could be made, right? He seems, thank you, JJ just provided the quotation there. Yes, on her forehead, a name was written, a mystery that means, you're supposed to interpret it, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Yeah, that's what's written on her forehead. Again, she's labeled so that you know how to interpret her. But again, that's not what he's doing here. He takes, the whore of Babylon is an icon. Right, is a go-to kind of interpretive figure in Ubertino's mind, right? Let this be a lesson to you. Beware the whore of Babylon, even when she assumes the form of the most exquisite creature. And it seems that he's, at least in part, maybe he's saying more than this also. But he certainly also seems to be saying, beware women, full stop. The idea that all women are a wicked temptation, that the whore of Babylon is the sort of a signpost to the true nature of women, all women, like women as a species, subspecies or whatever. I mean, I guess like this, I say species because when you read some medieval writers talking, it does sound almost as if they believe them to be a completely separate species. Not just, there's normal people like men, and then there's these other creatures, women, who were again often discussed as if they were wholly alien. And remember, of course, that almost all of these texts are being written by monks, most of whom have had very little contact with women at all. We will see, of course, if we ever get there, we may not finish the whole passage. I'm beginning to develop a concern that we're going to leave Adso in an awkward moment before the end of class here. But yes, Jackie, exactly. Women are, in fact, wholly alien to them. I think it's an important thing. I always, it's like... to make a Tolkien comparison, when you're reading Tolkien's letters, you always have to remember whom he's addressing, right? Like what's the context of that letter? When you're reading a medieval writer, it's often important to remember the context there also. Yes, and Calvin, that's exactly it. That's why when Adso sees the woman, he's like, what is this creature? Yes, because he's seen them. He's been out in the streets of cities and stuff. Like, he's seen women before, but he's not interacted with very many of them, right? Anyway, and what's more, when women are being discussed, when most of what you read about women is written by men to whom women are in fact alien, but also men who have not only separated themselves from women, but for whom sexual temptation is a major concern, right? Like, it's one of the things that they have sworn off is sexual contact with women. And yet they still experience temptations in that direction. And so it's one of the things we see poor Adso struggling, right? We saw poor Adso getting hot under the collar at Ubertino's description of sin before, right? This is an issue. And so this is not a justification. I'm not trying to defend the rampantly, violently, and often disgustingly anti-feminist rants of many medieval church writers. Many of them, very frequently, completely appalling. However, I'm trying to explain the mindset where those come from, is all. But this is one paradigm. There are two ways. If you're a monk, there are two ways to safely think about women. This is one. Whore of Babylon. Remember the whore of Babylon. Even when she assumes the form of the most. If you see a woman who looks attractive to you, it's because you are being deceived. You're being tempted, right? And you must be doubly on your guard, Adso, right? Then, secondly, there's the other paradigm, right? And that's the Virgin Mary, whom everyone reveres. Okay. Ubertino, I'm just going to start by saying, with a disclaimer, Ubertino, this is not a normal contemplation of the Virgin. There's room for criticism of Ubertino's spiritual approach here. Just saying. Okay. These are not things you should know. He drew me close again, embracing me and pointing to the statue of the Virgin. You must be introduced to the Immaculate Love. There is she in whom femininity is sublimated. This is why you may call her beautiful, like the beloved in the Song of Songs. In her, he said, his face carried away by an inner rapture, like the abbot's the day before when he spoke of gems and the gold of his vessels. In her, even the body's grace is a sign of the beauties of heaven, and this is why the sculptor has portrayed her with all the graces that should adorn a woman. He pointed to the Virgin's slender bust. This is where things start to really go off the rails. He pointed to the Virgin's slender bust, held high and tight by a cross-laced bodice, which the Christ child's tiny hands fondled. You see, as the doctors have said, beautiful also are the breasts, which protrude slightly, only faintly tumescent, oh dear, and do not swell licentiously, suppressed but not depressed. What do you feel before the sweetness of visions? I blushed violently, says Adso, feeling myself stirred as if by an inner fire. He's getting all hot under the collar again, right? Ubertino must have realized it, or perhaps he glimpsed my flushed cheeks, for he promptly added, but you must learn to distinguish the fire of supernatural love from the raving of the senses. It is difficult, even for the saints. Right. Kate says some of these monks might have done better to worry a little less about how they should think of women and a little more about how they shouldn't think of other monks. Yes, that is an image here. So yes, poor Adso not being led down the straight and narrow precisely here. So first of all, before we observe how badly Ubertino is marring this particular lesson, let us attempt to see the lesson he's pointing to, right? Ubertino's praise of the Virgin Mary, and specifically of her womanly form, does say it. There are some medieval teachers who simply were like, all women are evil all the time. Like, they're all the whore of Babylon, without exception. And then someone's like, what about the Virgin Mary? And they're like, well, accept that exception. And what about the other saints? Well, that's why they're saints, because they were exceptions, right? But anyway, like the obvious kind of contradictions that they would run themselves into in the extremity of their condemnation of women was obvious, like to everybody, even themselves, in some ways. And his consideration, like it is appropriate, he argues, for the sculptor who carved this statue of the Virgin Mary, to grace the body of the statue with womanly beauty. It is appropriate to give her breasts. Of course, any of you who have seen medieval artwork will know that there are many statues of the Virgin Mary that with her breasts naked, either with the Christ child suckling on her breasts, or even if she's just holding the Christ child, with her breasts revealed. Yes, like he's saying, it is right. It is right. Why is it right? Why is this? Why are the breasts of the Virgin Mary the sweetest of visions? Why may you call her beautiful like the beloved in the Song of Songs? Because her beauty, it's all about pointing, signs and signs and things, right? The beauty of the Virgin points upward. It is, he connects it to the Song of Songs, right? It's to emphasize her maternal nature. Yes. Okay, hang on. I'm about to make this more uncomfortable before it gets any better, and I can't actually promise it's going to get any better. But to make this more uncomfortable, notice the kind of circle that he's creating here. Oh, Sharon, I see that question. I'll come back to that. The Virgin, as virgin, set aside, right? Not an object of sexual desire, like the Virgin qua virgin, right? Not an object of sexual desire, is perfect femininity, perfect beauty. And in that way, he says, is like the beloved in the Song of Songs, who is distinctly not virginal, or at least not by the end of the book, right? That is to say, it is explicitly involved. So you've got the mother, but the mother who is not sexualized, not meant to be sexualized anyway, Ubertino, because she's the virgin, right? And yet then you also have the bride in the Song of Songs. So you have the perfect female beauty who is the Virgin Mother, and there's also the perfect female beauty who also represents God's beloved, who represents humankind cleansed of its sin and made the perfect match and mate for God himself. So the way in which, like, this begins to creep modern people out right away when thinking about the connection between the Virgin Mary. Like if I mean, you see what I mean, right? If the Virgin Mary is also the beloved in the Song of Songs, then she is both the mother of Jesus and his bride, which is uncomfortable and gets real creepy, right? But again, we're not thinking literally here. We're thinking metaphorically, we're thinking symbolically, we're thinking allegorically all the way through. Because, of course, that is, in one sense, the Virgin's role as this perfect. She represents. That's why Ubertino is pointing at her and saying she is the perfect beauty to contemplate, because she represents. If she is desirable in the way that holiness is desirable, that purity is desirable and should be attractive, because that's the kind of purity that we all shall be made into when we become ourselves the bride of Christ. Yes, exactly. Like in Revelation, where there is this other female allegorical figure in Revelation, for those who have done their homework, the woman clad in the sun, and she is like Mary. She's also the church, the representative of the church, the bride of the Lamb. Yes. Yes, exactly, Calvin. He said the sculptor gave her womanly beauties because it was appropriate, not because it was accurate. Yeah, it's not about the actual breasts of Mary, right? It's appropriate that she should be beautiful and desirable. And what he's talking about at the end, right? Distinguishing the fire of supernatural love from the raving of the senses is tricky, right? And this similarity, this was what led Adso into problems in the first place, right? And Ubertino admits it's difficult, even for the saints. And I think that we ourselves can step back from Ubertino and say, yeah, Ubertino, it is difficult, and you seem to be struggling more than you yourself would admit, aren't you? To distinguish between those two things. But this is something that in the medieval church, it would have been much more comfortable just to drop that connection entirely. The similarity between the two fires of love, we'll get more contemplation of this as we move forward. The two fiery desires, the pure spiritual desire and the physical desire. The similarity, and I've said this before, it is quite notable that the similarity in the language used to describe a spiritual transport and encounter with the divine, and the description of sexual orgasm, very similar. In places almost indistinguishable, which leads to lots of ribald humor. But it's tricky. Is it funny? Like, is the problem with them or is the problem with you as the reader, right? Is always the trick when thinking about that. And of course, First Fish, exactly as you suggest, the word rapture itself has it's a sexual word. To experience raptus means to be ravished. I mean, it's a rape word. It's a sexual word. So yes, even that word itself contains this combination of things within it. Yes, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa is an excellent example, Maureen. Now, let me get back, Sharon, to your question from before. In my opinion, does Eco paint a legit picture of the monk culture and thought accurately? Does he lean into stereotypes? So on the one hand, he certainly leans into stereotypes. But on the other hand, stereotypes are almost all we have. It's hard. We don't get a lot of people just we don't get a lot of journals kept by people. The texts that survive don't tend to be of the tell-all autobiography or private journal and letters revealed, or there's some of that kind of material that's out there, but not all that much. And so it's hard. It's hard to be sure how to, so actually the thing that we're describing today, the scene that we're getting at today, in the whole phenomenon that Eco is going to be describing today, and that he's alluded to before, is part of the problem. That is, remember how Brother William says that bookish monks, tend to interpret the world around them in the vocabulary of the books that they read. That Echo got that from somewhere. Like, that is clearly demonstrable. And it's hard to say when you're reading a historical account, or even when you're reading like a first person account. You know, you may be reading somebody speaking of themselves and their own experiences. That happens, like St. Augustine's Confessions or something. But when they describe their own experiences, what vocabulary are they using? You know, to what extent are they filtering their description of their experiences through the lens of, of what they read? So when you ask, in trying to ask a question like, were monks really like that? Or is that just a sort of a construction, a sort of a stereotype constructed about them? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It's tempting. Of course, many modern people, I have found, find it tempting to look at works like Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, or even more so, a work like Boccaccio's Decameron, and say, okay, that's the real stuff right there. Like, that's what those are real folks in those stories, right? That's like the gritty realism of what it was actually like. So, when you look at how he depicts monks, like that's probably like, a monk in Boccaccio is probably closer to what a real monk was like than these other pictures. I don't believe that. Eric says, yeah, fiction, that's the real stuff. Yeah, especially satire. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the problem that I have with that. There are a lot of, to be perfectly frank, I find that there are a lot of people who want to think poorly of medievals. And I can understand why. I can understand especially, after you've been reading these monks talking about how horrible women are all the time and without exception, that you then come across a scandalous satire of how horrible and hypocritical a monk is, and it's extremely cathartic to read, right? So I can understand, I can commiserate in every way with the feeling that says, okay, that's the picture I'm going to hold on to, right? Sure. But no, I'm not convinced that that's a truer picture. The one thing that I will say for the stereotypes that he's building here, that his imagination is definitely utilizing, is that they are stereotypes promulgated by the monks themselves. It's like their own stereotypes about themselves, right? Their own picture about themselves. Yeah. So, anyway, it's complicated. It's hard, as it's always hard, to figure out. Just like, you read Victorian newspapers and Victorian novels, and does that give you a picture of what life was really like? It'll tell you some things, right? But anyway, it's hard. And in the Middle Ages, I think it's harder just because we have less survives. Anyway, what I will say, what I do respect about Echo's depiction is that even though, he's certainly not going out of his way to depict all these people as wonderful. But I don't get the impression at anywhere along the line that he's making fun of them simply as being different. That is, making fun of them simply for not being modern or sharing modern values. I might be wrong. Like, I might be blinded to, a layer of satire in Echo. That seems very possible, but I don't think so. Anyway, well, yeah, we're not getting any further into I think everybody's stalling because they know it's coming. Everyone's embarrassed by the scene that's about to come. But let's move on from Ubertino as fast as we can. When Adso moves on from Ubertino, he immediately begins a lengthy recollection of the time when he was in Florence right before he met Brother William and saw one of the Dulcinians burned at the stake. And he lingers upon this memory of the whole day, the trial, and then the execution. He was there, saw the whole thing, right? This is the end of his description. Then the whole hut blazed up like a torch, and there was a great glow, as if it had not been for the poor charred body, and if it had not been for the poor charred body of Michael, still glimpsed among the glowing coals, I would have said I was standing before the burning bush. And I was close enough to have a view, I recalled as I climbed the steps of the library, that made some words rise spontaneously to my lips about ecstatic rapture. I had read them in the books of St. Hildegard. The flame consists of a splendid clarity, of an unusual vigor, and of an igneous ardor, but possesses the splendid clarity that it may illuminate, and the igneous ardor that it may burn. I remembered some words of Ubertino about love. The image of Michael on the pyre became confused with that of Dulcino, and that of Dulcino with that of the beautiful Margaret. I felt again the restlessness that had seized me in church. I tried not to think about it and headed straight for the labyrinth. I love the extra allegorical dimension that the labyrinth is given in Adso's wanderings here this evening. Okay, so we've already been reminded by our friend Ubertino, who seems keen to remind us of this at every turn that he gets an opportunity, of the parallel, the uncomfortable, to everybody, including Adso, parallel between spiritual ardor and sexual desire and carnal desire, right? There's the sensation of sexual desire, and there's the sensation of spiritual ardor, of spiritual rapture. And those two are uncomfortably like one another. And he now adds a third leg to this tripod of discomfort, right? And that is the fire in which the heretic was burned. The actual fire of execution, the stake itself. The whole hut blazed up like a torch, and there was a great glow. And if it had not been for the poor charred body of Michael, I would have said I was standing before the burning bush. Burning bush? What does it mean to stand before the burning bush? By the way, I didn't, but that's a classic example of a sentence I would have put in one of the tests in my old Bible class. Moses, yes, before God on Sinai, yes. Moses is right with his flocks, minding his business in the wilderness on Mount Sinai. And sees a bush burning with fire but not being consumed. Curious about this phenomenon, he approaches it, and a voice speaks to him out of the fire saying, "You are on holy ground, take off your shoes." Right. This is before Sinai. This is not same place, different time. It's actually, my Hebrew is practically non-existent, but my understanding is that actually the name Mount Sinai, the name Sinai, is actually a reference to this. Like the word Sinai comes from the word of for like the bush, like the tree that was burning. They go back to the same place. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Same place, different time. Moses has a number of striking experiences on this particular mountaintop. Yeah. Okay, so in other words, that same spiritual ardor, that same spiritual rapture, that sensation of being in the presence of God, he had an experience like that watching Michael be burned at the stake. And you'll remember why, in part. You'll remember why, in part. Because he, in his description of Michael's, brother Michael's, we don't know anything about him apart from the fact that he was a follower of Fra Dolcino, a proponent of poverty, and condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake, right? But Adso was really impressed by his whole demeanor and attitude. And he described him in his trial, and he described him walking through the streets and people crying out to him, and the fortitude and serenity with which, determination even, with which Michael went to his death, right? The way in which he, Brother Michael, the guy he executed himself, seemed to consider his own funeral pyre not his place of torture and defeat, but his place of victory. And that that was something that impressed Adso about that situation, and I think that's why he's comparing the funeral pyre, the heretical pyre, right, of Michael, as to the burning bush, because Michael himself has come into the presence of God, right? And he, Adso, watching Michael, feels like Moses standing in front of the burning bush. He seems to feel the impulse to take his shoes off as he's watching Michael burn to death. And Michael was a Dulcinian, which I think is part of the reason why, because remember, he didn't know. He didn't, at the time that he was watching Michael being burned at the stake, he didn't know who Fra Dolcino was or why he was wrong, right? It's one of the reasons why he's asking about this now. Yes, Mount Horeb, right, because it's that. I know that there are people who debate everything about the Bible. So I know there are people who debate whether Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai were the same thing. My understanding from the text has always been that they are the same place. And that's been my understanding from the study that I've done. It certainly was the medieval tradition. I shouldn't say certainly and then end the sentence with I think. I believe that was also the medieval tradition there. Called Mount Horeb because it wasn't called Mount Sinai yet, because it's only called Mount Sinai after the bush incident. Okay. Right. So for now, let us just carry on with our discomfort. Burning at the stake, sexual desire, rapturous experience coming into the presence of God. These three things all being kind of combined together. We won't go that far, but we'll go a little bit. Perhaps I won't leave Adso in an awkward position. He's in the library. Remember, he's gone to the labyrinth by himself, just because, right? Adso feeling rebellious, characterizes it as a rebellious feeling. I opened another book, and this seemed of the Hispanic school. So he notices, he's like, I'm trying to figure out my way around, but then he's like, actually, hang on. There's this table full of books. These books weren't here when I was here with William last night. So he's just looking at the books. I opened another book, and this seemed of the Hispanic school. The colors were violent. The reds suggested blood or fire. It was the book of Revelation of the Apostle. And once again, as the night before, I happened upon the page of the Mulier Amicta Sole. But it was not the same book. The illumination was different. This is the woman clothed with the sun, yeah? The other woman, not the whore of Babylon, but the good one, if I am remembering correctly here. The illumination was different. Here the artist had dwelled at greater length on the woman's form. Oh dear, just like Ubertino. I compared her face, her bosom, her curving thighs with the statue of the Virgin I had seen with Ubertino. Thanks, Ubertino. The line was different, but this Moulière also seemed, which just means woman, also seemed very beautiful to me. I thought I should not dwell on these notions, but I turned several more pages. I found another woman, but this time it was the whore of Babylon. I was not so much struck by her form as by the thought that she too was a woman, like the other, and yet this one was the vessel of every vice, whereas the other was the receptacle of every virtue. But the forms were womanly in both cases, and at a certain point I could no longer understand what distinguished them. Again I felt an inner agitation. The image of the Virgin in the church became superimposed on that of the beautiful Margaret. I am damned, I said to myself, or I am mad, and I decided I should leave the library. You see how Jackie says, this poor kid. I know, right? The way that he has combined. Sorry, I'm laughing at myself because I hear my printer just turned on, which means that my teenage son is about to come in and get his things, and now he's going to like come in the middle of this conversation. So I'm going to be doubly embarrassed here in a minute. Yeah, anyway, I agree, Jackie. He's totally, poor Adso is completely messed up here. So, notice how, remember the two things, spiritual love and carnal love, to put it really crudely, to put it really simply, right? Spiritual contemplation, experience, direct experience of the divine, and carnal experience, direct experience of the woman's body, right, in sexual love, are paralleled, right? Ubertino has successfully entangled them quite firmly, right, in his mind, and he can't tell them apart. And he's marveling at how the same figure, the figure of the woman's body, represents both things and stirs both kinds of desires, right? And he is completely confused. He feels an inner agitation, but he's not even sure what agitation it is that he's feeling, right? Is he going in the positive direction? Right, it's good in bad case, and it's good in one case and bad in the other. Yeah, exactly. And he doesn't know what to do with these superimposed images. Okay. We'll end after this. Maybe these next two are, yeah. We'll end after these next two. This is his segue into his encounter in the kitchen. And of course, old Adso, the writer, is feeling some uncertainty about what it would be best or appropriate for him to do here, right? Because he runs the risk, depending on how he describes this scene, he runs the risk of Ubertinoing all of us, right? The classic problem we've discussed before arises here again. And while my rational instinct was to cry out, "Vade retro!" People can guess what that means, right? Vade retro. Go back. Get behind me. It's what Jesus says to the devil. Get behind me, Satan. I think is what he's referring to here. His rational instinct is to say, get back, right? Back off with overlays of get behind me, Satan, right? And get away from the moaning thing that was certainly a succubus summoned for me by the evil one. Obviously, that's what it was. Something in my vis appetitiva urged me forward, as if I wanted to take part in some marvel. He's got the two impulses. And so I approached the shadow until, in the moonlight that fell from the high windows, I realized that it was a woman, trembling, clutching to her breast, one hand holding a package, and drawing back, weeping, toward the mouth of the oven. May God, the Blessed Virgin, and all the saints of paradise assist me in telling what then happened. Modesty, the dignity of my position as an aged monk by now in this handsome monastery of Milk, a haven of peace and serene meditation, would counsel me to take the most devout precautions. I should simply say that something evil took place and that it would not be meet to tell what it was, and so I would upset neither my reader nor myself. That's the simple path of prudence, right? But I have determined to tell of those remote events the whole truth, and truth is indivisible. It shines with its own transparency and does not allow itself to be diminished by our interests or our shame. The problem is rather of telling what happened not as I see it now and remember it, even if I still remember everything with pitiless vividness, nor do I know whether my subsequent repentance has so fixed in my memory these situations and thoughts, or whether the inadequacy of that same repentance still torments me, resuscitating in my oppressed mind the smallest details of my shame. But as I saw it and felt it then. Poor Adso. He's still confused. Right? Notice what he's suggesting here, right? He retains quite vivid memories of this particular encounter. Why? Because he's rehearsed it a lot, right? Because he's found many occasions, it sounds like, to confess it again, or to confess the very act of remembering it again. It lives on in his memory, as it shouldn't. But of course, the act of confessing it also helps to cement it in his memory. He's a little trapped when it comes to that. Yes, Fencing Frog, I agree. He's clearly meditated on his sin a lot over the years. Absolutely. But again, notice his problem, right? He's like, okay, so my problem is I don't want to I've contemplated it a lot. I've confessed it many times, right? I don't just want to talk about how it looks to me now and how I feel about it now. He says, I'm trying to see it and remember it as I saw it and felt it then. And I can do so with the fidelity of a chronicler, for if I close my eyes, I can repeat not only everything I did, but also what I thought in those moments, as if I were copying a parchment written at the time. He remembers very clearly what he felt in the moment. By the way, why? I don't mean why was he going over this. Do you see what he's doing? Why has he made this choice? Why didn't he fade to black? First fish, as you were saying. He says that, like, it's the dignity of his position, modesty, these would counsel him to take the most devout precautions against this. What can we see in his choice to do this? Well, possibly several things, and I'm not suggesting we're psychoanalyzing Adso here. What I am suggesting, though, is that he is a student of his master. This is just what Brother William would have wanted. He is, in fact, following. This is a really important moment because it's one of the first places where it has become totally clear the primary way in which Brother William has influenced Adso, and how this book represents a kind of testimony to the way of thinking of Adso's master, Brother William. He is going to focus not up but down, describe the details, make observations. He's going to present it with the fidelity of a chronicler. He's going to copy, as if from a parchment written at the time, everything he did and everything he thought. You see? That's what Brother William keeps saying. It's all about the facts. It's all about the details. It's all about looking down, right? Looking down through your little pince-nez magnifying reading glasses, right? At the details of things. And then from that drawing conclusions as to what occurred. Rather than reading up, taking an interpretation, taking an allegorical reading, and and using that to impose structure on the things that you see. He's not going to do that. He's following. He's following his master here. One more. What did I feel? What did I see? I remember only that the emotions of the first moment were bereft of any expression, because my tongue and my mind had not been instructed in how to name sensations of that sort. Remember I said about imposing order upon things, right? This is one of the reasons why the allegorical interpretation, why the upward, is so comforting. Because you already have the categories, right? You have ready-made categories in which to put everything that happens. But when he turns away from that, when Adso the writer turns away from that, what he acknowledges is that the experience that he was having in that moment, when he sees the woman in the kitchen, his tongue and his mind had no categories. He doesn't even know how to describe it. Until I recalled other inner words, heard in another time and in other places, spoken certainly for other ends, but which seemed wondrously in keeping with my joy in that moment, as if they had been born for the very purpose of expressing it. Words pressed into the caverns of my memory rose to the dumb surface of my lips, and I forgot that they had served in Scripture or in the pages of the saints to express quite different, more radiant realities. But was there truly a difference between the delights of which the saints had spoken and those that my agitated spirit was feeling at that moment? At that moment, the watchful sense of difference was annihilated in me. And this, it seems to me, is precisely the sign of rapture in the abysses of identity. What does he find? When he has these experiences, when he perceives these sensations, he starts speaking of them using the language, using spiritual language, using the language of the Bible. This is why he starts quoting the Song of Songs, right? And it doesn't feel to him inappropriate at all. Yes, the watchful sense of difference. The watchful sense of difference was annihilated in me. That part of him that's trying to distinguish, that's trying to figure out these feelings that I'm having, are they good feelings or bad feelings? Is this a holy ardor or is this sinful lust? This has been his problem. I mean, okay, it's one version of his problem. Between truth and error, between truth and heresy, right? And when he comes in this moment where he is experiencing those sensations, he's been having sensations, right? He was having sensations when Ubertino was describing sin. He was having sensations when looking at the statue of the Virgin Mary under the dubious instruction of Ubertino. He was having sensations when looking at the illustrations of the woman clad in the sun and the whore of Babylon, right? Now he's having sensations when looking at the actual woman. And when he does, he finds that the only words that he has are the words of the saints, the words of the Bible. And yet he finds, rather than having that create a crisis, a deeper crisis for him, oh my gosh, is this appropriate, right? He finds that watchful sense of difference. Is it good or is it bad? Is it good or is it bad? It's annihilated in that moment. And this, it seems to me, he says, is precisely the sign of rapture in the abysses of identity. The rapture of the holy ardor of the saints when they are encountering God. Like Moses did outwardly in the burning bush, like many of the saints did in their contemplations. There is an abyss of identity when you cease to be you and are joined with the divine. is anyway how the saints that Ubertina was talking about were describing it. And he finds the same thing sort of happening in his response to seeing the young woman sitting there on the floor of the kitchen. Right. Okay. Yes. Let's stop there before things get any hotter and heavier than this with poor Edso. Let's leave it there for this week. We will return to the, I'm not even going to use any nouns, about the end of this scene. We'll read the rest of the scene next time, and then look at some of Brother William's direct commentary upon it. And then we shall suddenly get back to the murder mystery. I know that it seems like we're slowing down indefinitely and like never getting to that, like we're never going to be done with this book ever. But this particular passage is a very important and striking one, I think. And I think it's one thing when you talk about a scene like this, not just a sex scene, but a sex scene which is all involved in allegory and representation and you know, multiple aspects of looking at it. You can't, like, one's own analytical language is always is inevitably and comically compromised. But anyway, but as I say, I think that this is an important moment for these different themes that we've been looking at. And I think it's worth spending some time because these are the things I think. These are the things that Umberto Eco... This is what... The book is much more interested in this stuff than it's interested in the murder mystery, right? The murder mystery itself is only a vehicle for getting at this. And that's the fun thing about when you make Sherlock Holmes a 14th century Franciscan. All right. Join us next week when things get really hot and heavy in our interpretation of this scene. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. And I will see you guys next time. Bye now.